Hi everyone, today I want to show you this recipe for making red bean madeleine cakes. We'll start by making the red bean paste first. You can also use this for other fillings as well. So it's 100 grams or about 1/3 of a cup of dried red beans or Adzuki beans, and you're supposed to rinse them first, but I forgot to. But anyway, add them to a saucepan, add enough water to cover about 2 to 3 centimeters on top of the beans, and then cook on medium heat with the lid semi-covered. This is the first boil. You'll have to check it every couple minutes to make sure there's still water. If it starts looking dry, you have to add more water. So for me, I ended up doubling the amount of water that I added. When you check on it every couple minutes, you also want to give it a stir just to make sure nothing's sticking to the bottom. Most red bean paste recipes ask you to soak the beans overnight, but this requires planning ahead, which isn't always easy to do. So this actually saves time. You cook it once for about 30 minutes and the beans puff up a bit, the skin might start falling off a little bit, and then you let it cool completely for about 30 minutes to an hour. And then the beans soften up a little bit more. You can kind of squish them if you push hard enough with a wooden spoon. And now you want to bring it back to a boil again for the second boil. So same thing, medium heat with the lid semi-covered, and stir and add water every couple minutes. You do want to be a bit stingy about how much water you add in the second boil because your goal is to thicken the mixture a little bit. So add a tablespoon or two at a time. The second boil takes about 45 minutes and the beans should be really soft and squishy and the skins should start popping off. And now it's time to add flavoring, and this depends on your taste. I don't like my red bean paste that sweet, so I add a bit of salt and a bit of sugar, and I do find that brown sugar goes better with the red bean flavor. If you like your paste sweeter, you can add up to 100 grams of sugar, and then just stir it in and return back to the heat to cook on low so that the sugar melts. Now I'm not going to add any oil or fat to this because I'm just adding it to a cake batter, but if you were making this as a filling, then you can add about 40 grams of butter to make a smoother mouthfeel, and then just set it aside to cool. Before we start making the batter, let's butter the tins first. So I'm using these small Madeleine shells. You can also use mini cupcake tins as well. Just make sure you butter everything really well, especially if you have ridges on your baking shells. And although I'm using Madeleine tins, this recipe is a little bit different from traditional Madeleine cakes in that it's fluffier and more crumbly. The texture is kind of a hybrid between a pound cake and a soft cookie. To make the actual batter, start with 120 grams of unsalted butter. Make sure it's at room temperature and then cream it, or otherwise stir really vigorously until it becomes pale yellow and fluffy. You can definitely do this easily by hand as well. And if you're using a mixer, it's super important to scrape the sides of your bowl and the paddle regularly. And this will ensure that you'll get an even texture. Once your butter is nicely creamed pale yellow, you can add 2 large egg yolks one at a time and stir in between. Make sure you're also scraping the bowl and the paddle between additions as well. Egg yolks generally mix into butter really well, so this is actually a very therapeutic procedure to do by hand. Now looking at this video, I kind of wish I did this by hand. Now to add the dry ingredients, which is 110 grams of cake flour and 6 grams of baking powder. And I like to stir the baking powder into the flour as I sift it. And you do have to sift cake flour because it does form clumps. And also you want the baking powder to be distributed evenly in the flour so you don't get any bitter taste in your cake. It's not a lot of flour, so you can add all at once and then start stirring this by hand. After a few stirs, you can add a teaspoon of Earl Grey tea, so this is just cut out from half of a tea bag, and then 120 grams of the cooked and cooled red bean paste. You can see that I actually fished out the beans first because I wanted to see whole beans, but if you wanted to puree your red bean paste and then just add 120 grams right now, it will be fine as well. So at this point, you'll find the mixture is actually looking more like a cookie dough than a cake batter. And in fact, if you were to add a bit of sugar, like maybe 60 grams or so, and then bake this, you'd get a nice crisp and tender cookie. Since we're making a cake, we're going to add some beaten egg whites to this. So I'm going to move my batter dough into a separate bowl and clean this bowl so that I can beat egg whites in it. And then I thought I wanted to add a bit more of the red bean color and flavors, so I scooped a bit more of the paste, and this time with more liquid, and then just stirred this in. So if you pureed your paste, you can also add about 60 grams more of the red bean puree. It'll add a bit more red bean flavor and maybe make the cakes a little bit more moist, but otherwise won't change the texture too much. And once this part's done, you're finally ready to start beating the egg whites, which I always reserve to the last step so they don't deflate. And before you do that, you want to preheat your oven to 350 Fahrenheit or 176 Celsius. Egg white part, you want about 80 grams or about 2.5 large egg whites. You want to start whisking on medium until it becomes foamy, so you should see the coarse bubbles, and then the bottom should still have some clear egg whites. And then it's time to add the sugar, so it's 45 grams of granulated sugar, but you want to add this in thirds and then whisk between each addition. So if you're whisking by machine, it's medium speed or speed 6. If you're doing it by hand, you can just go as fast as you can. After about 30 seconds to a minute, you'll see that the foam becomes a bit finer and you'll see the pattern that the whisk leaves in the mixture. So it's time to add the second third of the sugar and continue whisking on medium. After another 30 seconds or so, you'll reach a soft peak stage where you lift the whisk and the peak will slump back down, but keep its contour. So add the rest of the sugar and continue whisking on medium until you get firm peaks. You want to be careful not to overbeat it, because after the firm peak stage, you'll reach a stiff peak, which is less stable, and after that it just splits and gets crumbly and you'll have to start over again. So this is one of the reasons why I like using a medium speed, because it gives you a bit more of a safety window, a bit longer time before it gets overbeat. This is the firm peak stage where you lift the whisk and the peak holds its shape, but there's a little bit of a curl at the end. To fold the egg whites into your cake batter, you actually want to glob a spoonful of the egg whites into your stiff batter first, and then just kind of stir it vigorously. This just lightens the batter. You don't have to worry about folding it delicately in this first step, because we're going to add more egg whites later. So it's more important to just work fast at this stage and get it mostly mixed in first. Once your first addition of the egg whites is somewhat well stirred in, it's time to add that batter to the rest of the egg whites. And then this part you do want to fold gently but thoroughly. This recipe is really great to work with because it's not as delicate as a chiffon cake or an angel food cake. You can add heavy ingredients like the red bean or deflate the egg whites a little bit and they'll still rise because you've got that little bit of baking powder. And once you're done stirring, it's time to add it to the tins. So I used a piping bag for this one without a piping tip, just because I found it easier and faster to fill the tins and neater as well, but you can definitely use 2 spoons. If you are using a piping bag, make sure to cut the tip generously so the red beans don't get stuck. When you're filling the cake tins, fill them about 3/4 of the way. Because it's already fluffy from the egg whites, the batter won't rise too much, but it will even out as it bakes. Depending on the size of your tins, you want to bake these at 350 Fahrenheit or 176 Celsius for about 12 to 15 minutes or until golden brown on top. If you poke a toothpick in, it should come out clean. One of the good things about adding beans is that it has the fiber content to hold moisture in a gelatinized state, so even if you overbake these, it won't dry out as easily. Once they come out of the oven, you can leave these in the tin for about 10 to 15 minutes until they're cool enough to touch, and then gently ease them out of the tin. They should come out pretty readily if you butter them enough. And they also smell really good. So this flavor combo between the Earl Grey and the red bean, I only found out that they go really well together when I was doing some recipe testing for my mom's birthday cake a couple years back. And ever since then, I've been trying to combine them in a single recipe, and I think these cakes kind of do it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you do try these out. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Follow me on Instagram, and I'll see you next video. Bye!